This is the tale of ancient kingdoms so ruthless, so entrenched in visceral violence, that even the mighty Roman Empire shuddered before crossing the cold, churning waters of the Channel. Prepare yourselves, because the myth of Arthur, the legend of the Saxons, and the very foundation of modern life rests on the spine-chilling chaos we are about to unveil. Can you believe that for centuries, this misty, isolated land was home to tribes who practiced human sacrifice on a scale that defies imagination, governed by shadowy priests who held the power of life and death, communicating with forces no modern man can comprehend? The year is roughly 75 BC. Forget the comfortable timeline you learned in school. In this pre-dawn age, the land we call Britain was a mosaic of rival territories, each dominated by warlords more savage than the last, their borders defined not by treaty, but by the stack of enemy skulls left warning those who dared to trespass. Every hill fort, from the colossal earthworks of Maiden Castle to the northern strongholds of the Pennines, was a fortress of fear, perpetually guarded against surprise raids. We are talking about the Brigantes, the colossal power of the north, commanding vast territories stretching from sea to sea, a confederation of savage strength that Rome would spend centuries trying to break. And down in the chilling marshes of East Anglia, the Iceni, a tribal nucleus defined by its fierce independence and the gold torques of its royalty, unknowingly preparing the ground for the single most devastating rebellion the ancient world ever witnessed. A catastrophe no one saw coming was already assembling on the horizon. Across the narrow strip of water, the shadow of the eagle was growing, feeding on conquest and fueled by an insatiable hunger for glory, gold, and slaves. The people of Britain, isolated and fragmented by constant internal strife, were completely unprepared for the sheer, organized, mechanized horror of the coming legions. They fought each other, obsessively focusing on localized vendettas and cattle rustling, while the true existential threat gathered like a devastating thunderhead. This instability was the island's greatest weakness, a vulnerability that their eventual conquerors would ruthlessly exploit. Imagine a society where one word from a robed priest could send a king into exile or condemn an entire captured army to a fiery end inside a monstrous wicker man. This was the terrifying reality of the British Iron Age. Their knowledge, passed down orally through generations, was a secret weapon, encompassing astronomy, law, and medicine, giving them an intellectual superiority that was both respected and utterly feared by Rome itself. They knew the deep, primal secrets of the island, secrets buried in the chalk downs and the misty moors, secrets that predated even the stones of Stonehenge, which stood as a silent, inexplicable monument to a power even older than their own. Offending a Druid was not just a social faux pas, it was a guaranteed death sentence sealed by divine disapproval, ensuring that their religious mandate superseded all political law. The southernmost tribes, the Belgae influx, were already being subtly corrupted, absorbing continental trade and technology, creating a dangerous cultural divide within the island itself. These southern kingdoms, the Atrebates, the Catuvellauni, the Trinovantes, were the first dominoes, establishing intricate trade networks, minting crude but recognizable coins, and unknowingly signing their own death warrants through their increasing contact with mainland Europe. They were becoming too rich, too tempting, too exposed. And when a land becomes too tempting, the gaze of the Roman eagle inevitably turns towards it. The Catuvellauni, led by fiercely ambitious leaders like Cassivellaunis, dominated the territory north of the Thames, masters of the chariot, growing fat by subjugating weaker neighbors, creating the perfect environment for foreign intervention. The year is now 55 BC. The air crackles with anticipation, a low, ominous hum that only the most sensitive Druids could perceive. Across the water, in Gaul, one man, a general driven by unimaginable ambition, was completing the conquest of an entire continent. His name? Gaius Julius Caesar. He looked across the Mare Britannicum, not seeing a misty island, but seeing a treasure chest of resources, a staging ground for enemies, and most importantly, a stage large enough for his own legend to be written in eternal stone. He claimed his invasion was merely punitive, designed to stop the British tribes from aiding their Gallic cousins. That was the lie he told the Senate. The terrifying truth was far simpler. Britain was the ultimate prize, the final, wild frontier that offered glory unmatched by any previous conquest. Can you believe the sheer breathtaking arrogance of this man? He assembled his legions, the finest killing machines the world had ever known, preparing to launch a strike against a land he knew almost nothing about, relying only on vague trade reports and the whispers of terrified merchants. This decision, this single act of monumental hubris, would trigger centuries of relentless bloodshed, fundamentally reshaping the geography, the politics, and the very DNA of the British Isles. When Caesar's ships finally breached the white cliffs of Dover, carrying the weight of the empire and the iron certainty of conquest, the history of the ancient kingdoms didn't just change, it detonated. This is where our terrifying deep dive truly begins. Prepare for the moment the isolation ended and the slaughter started. This is the history they tried to bury. The year is 55 BC, and the prophecy of doom, foretold in the steaming, bloody entrails by the high Druids, finally materialized on the horizon. The sound of silence that had protected the coastal tribes of Kent was ripped apart by the most terrifying noise they had ever known, the rhythmic, synchronized churning of hundreds of Roman oars cutting through the Channel fog. This was not a raiding party. This was a geometric horror, a ghost fleet of hundreds of transports carrying the industrial-grade killing machine that was the Roman legion, 7-foot shields, standardized armor, and the cold, terrifying discipline of men who knew nothing but conquest. Julius Caesar, the butcher of Gaul, was here, seeking glory and, more importantly, the strategic resources and immense prestige that subjugating this savage island would bring him back in Rome. The British tribes, fragmented but fiercely independent, watched the invasion unfold with a mixture of terror and white-hot fury. The first landings were an utter, bloody scramble onto the shingle beaches, with legionaries trying to wade ashore while being hammered relentlessly by slingshots and javelins hurled down from the cliffs. These were not disorganized barbarians. They were desperate, hardened warriors, fighting for their gods and their mud-soaked ancestral lands, spurred on by the terrifying, painted priests lurking just beyond the tree line. The Romans were stunned by the sheer ferocity, expecting a simple, quick, provincial conquest. But Britain was already proving to be a jagged, poisoned blade plunged into the heart of Caesar's ambition. Then came the ultimate terror weapon that froze the blood even of the hardened Roman centurions, the dreaded British war chariot, the Iceni. Imagine the sound. iron-rimmed wheels screaming over the ground, the drivers standing tall, hurling spears with deadly accuracy, maneuvering with impossible precision at impossible speeds. They would tear into the Roman flanks, the warriors leaping off the moving platform to fight on foot, then remounting in a terrifying, deadly ballet of speed and slaughter, disappearing back into the dense British forests before the cohorts could even form a proper defensive line. They moved like vengeful ghosts in the swirling coastal fog, impossible to corner, tearing apart the disciplined Roman formation with brutal surgical efficiency. Caesar's great initial adventure in 55 BC was a humiliating, bloody disaster, a failure masked only by his own mastery of propaganda back in Rome. His already damaged fleet was dealt a final, catastrophic blow by a sudden, vicious storm. The gods of Britain, perhaps, defending their turf, forcing a panicked, disorganized retreat back across the Channel before the winter set in. For the next attempt in 54 BC, he returned with a vengeance, bringing a truly staggering, apocalyptic force. 5 entire legions and 2,000 cavalry, nearly 30,000 professional killers transported on 800 ships. This was no longer an invasion. It was an extinction-level event aimed squarely at the heart of the British resistance. Facing this overwhelming, inevitable catastrophe, the previously fragmented kingdoms finally, miraculously unified, a political miracle orchestrated out of sheer primal desperation. Their chosen warlord, the legendary, almost mythological figure of Catuvellauni, king of the Catuvellauni, rose to lead the desperate defense, uniting disparate tribes under a single, burning banner of resistance. Catuvellauni understood immediately that he could not possibly win a pitched, stand-up battle against the disciplined, industrial Roman killing machine. His strategy was pure genius and pure terror, scorched earth tactics, retreating deep into the wild interior and utilizing the deep, confusing forests and swamps as their primary weapon, turning the entire island into a gigantic, deadly trap. Every shadow hit a javelin, every stream was a poisoned obstacle, every evacuated village was a lure. The Romans managed to push inland, burning hill forts and crossing the formidable River Thames, but they found nothing truly valuable to conquer, only empty land and fiercely resisting ghostly snipers. Caesar learned the hard way that capturing territory was utterly useless if the enemy simply vanished into the mist, only to reappear hours later and butcher his essential supply lines with relentless surgical precision. The Roman soldiers were constantly on edge, haunted by the unseen enemy and terrified by the Druidic rituals they witnessed from afar. The Druids were not just spiritual leaders now. They were active military assets, whipping the warriors into a frenzy of religious fanaticism, promising instant glory in the afterlife for those who died fighting the foreign defilers. Their immense influence made the British fighters absolutely fearless, viewing death in battle not as an end, but as a glorious, immediate transition into eternal legend. Despite winning several devastating tactical engagements and forcing minor tribes like the Brigantes to surrender and betray Catuvellauni, Caesar realized the conquest was fundamentally unsustainable, too costly in both blood and gold. He had spent 2 grueling summers, lost thousands of men, and gained nothing but a flimsy, quickly broken promise of tribute from Catuvellauni, a promise that would be utterly ignored the second the Roman sails disappeared over the horizon. The great Julius Caesar, the ultimate conqueror of Gaul, failed utterly to conquer Britain. He left in 54 BC, but the damage was devastating and permanent. Rome had tasted the blood of Britain, and the tribes had tasted the overwhelming, terrifying power of the ultimate empire. The isolation was truly, irrevocably over. The next 97 years, almost a full century, would be the most treacherous, nerve-wracking period in British history. The agonizing, inescapable wait for the inevitable, crushing return. The fractured kingdoms now had a single century to prepare, to fortify, to evolve, or to collapse into the shadows of betrayal and internecine warfare. And those shadows were already stretching long across the fragile Celtic world. But power in Britain was not measured only by the sharpness of a spear or the height of an earthwork. It was measured by the sheer, unholy terror inspired by the men in white robes, the Druids. These were not gentle priests whispering benign prophecies. They were the ultimate arbiters of law, the keepers of ancient, horrifying secrets, and the spiritual commanders of entire armies. Their influence stretched like an invisible, suffocating net across every single chieftain and every single hill fort. Imagine a world where the tax collector, the judge, the doctor, and the executioner were all the same person, draped in the pristine white of ritual purity, yet their hands were perpetually stained red. The Druids were the intellectual and religious backbone, the terrifying glue holding the fragmented society together, and their power was absolute, bypassing the authority of any single king. To disobey a Druid was not just sedition, it was sacrilege, guaranteeing not just your death, but the damnation of your entire lineage. They presided over ceremonies that would make the hardened Roman legionary vomit in disbelief and fear. We are talking, of course, about the infamous Wicker Man, colossal effigies woven from willow, stuffed with human beings. Often criminals, yes, but sometimes captured enemies, sometimes even those deemed unacceptable by the council, and set ablaze as a monumental offering to the terrifying, capricious gods of the forest and the sky. This was society governed by divine, public savagery. The powerful Iceni in the east, later to become the legendary symbols of ultimate defiance against the empire, were at this time merely a prosperous, isolated tribe, focused intensely on their horses and their exquisite metalwork, believing the sheer distance of the freezing sea was an impenetrable shield. They traded with the continent, they grew rich, but they had absolutely no concept of the logistical nightmare Rome could overcome, or the sheer industrial scale of violence Julius Caesar commanded. Caesar. The name itself was a thunderclap waiting to break the historical silence. He had marched across Gaul, the lands of their continental cousins, in a terrifying, blazing arc of horrifying efficiency. Rivers of blood had soaked the mainland, and the reports, carried by frantic refugees and terrified traders, should have sparked a desperate, unified defense among the British. Instead, the kings of Britain merely listened to the reports as if they were fantastic, impossible myths, dismissing the organized murder of millions as continental folly that could never touch their shores. They were too busy arguing over grazing rights in the Midlands or who controlled the best salt mines in the West, their entire focus internal and short-sighted. Their strategic blindness was catastrophic, a fatal flaw written into the very DNA of their political structure. They failed completely to see that Caesar wasn't coming for conquest yet. He was coming for vengeance and stabilization. He was coming to cut the head off the snake of persistent rebellion, and that head was located squarely in the dark, mysterious groves of the British Druids. Every time a Gallic chieftain was defeated, he fled across the water to the supposed sanctuary of Britannia, where the Druids sheltered the rebels and fueled the fire of continued resistance against the Roman boot. Caesar needed to show the entire world, and more importantly, the cynical Senate back in Rome, that the absolute edge of the known world was no longer safe for his enemies or for those who harbored them. He needed a punitive, terrifying strike that would resonate across the centuries. The year is now 55 BCE. The summer winds are changing, blowing across the channel and carrying the scent of salt, and soon the metallic scent of impending doom. Across the water, the machinery of the ultimate military machine in history is grinding into relentless motion. Thousands of legionaries, hardened by years of brutal, successful campaigning, are receiving their final, terrifying orders. They are packing their pila, sharpening their gladi, and looking toward the gray, unfamiliar horizon of this mythical island. They know their general is planning something unprecedented. No one in Britain truly understood the scale of the threat about to descend upon their shores. They thought they were facing a raiding party, perhaps a punitive expedition that would turn back after a minor skirmish. They thought their misty island, defended by primal gods and impenetrable forests, was protected by divine favor and the sheer distance of the sea. They were tragically, devastatingly wrong in every single metric. Caesar was not merely sending an army to skirmish. He was sending a statement, a permanent marker written in the indelible ink of Roman steel and the blood of the opposition. The invasion was imminent, a sudden, horrifying storm about to break over the heads of the unsuspecting Catuvellauni and Trinovantes, shattering the delicate, bloody balance of power that had defined Britain for millennia. The tribal kings were about to meet the true meaning of organized warfare, an enemy who fought not with courage alone, but with engineering, logistics, and terrifying discipline, and the consequence would be absolute annihilation for those who dared stand in the way of the unstoppable eagle. The sheer terror of that summer day, when the black shapes of the Roman ships appeared like monstrous insects on the horizon, was a moment that would fundamentally redefine the very DNA of the British Isles forever. They had one last moon cycle of fragile peace, and then the silence would be broken by the agonizing screams of battle. The year is 55 BC. And across the churning, unforgiving emerald waters of the English Channel, a shadow was beginning to stretch, a monumental, terrifying blot upon the horizon that the isolated islanders of Britannia had never conceived possible. They had lived for centuries in the blissful ignorance of their own self-made chaos, convinced that the surrounding ocean was their ultimate impenetrable shield, a natural fortress guarded by the howling gods of the sea. But now, that ancient, comforting lie was being ripped apart, shredded by the sight of massive, disciplined Roman triremes slicing through the waves like hungry, bronze-plated sharks, their sails swollen with the promise of doom and disruption. These weren't the disorganized, howling pirates the Britons occasionally faced. This was the hammer of the nascent Roman Empire, commanded by the man whose name would forever be etched in blood into the annals of history, Gaius Julius Caesar himself. The very mention of Caesar's name, even carried across the distance by panicked Gaulish traders who dared cross the narrow strip of water, sounded like a death knell echoing through the sacred groves of the British Druids. They spoke of legions that marched not as men, but as a single, unstoppable metal serpent, capable of extinguishing entire nations with frightening efficiency and utterly emotionless discipline. fueled by generations of conquest and an insatiable lust for glory. In the deepest, foggiest parts of the ancient forests, where the sun rarely dared to penetrate, the revered Druids, the true uncrowned kings of the British spirit, were frantic, their authority suddenly seeming fragile against this metallic tide. Their elaborate, blood-soaked rituals, designed for generations to summon terrible storms and to confuse invaders, seemed to falter against the iron will and cold engineering of the Roman military machine. While the terrifying fleet approached, the response from the British tribal kings was not one of unified defiance, but of predictable, pathetic, and ultimately fatal internecine squabbling, a hallmark of their ancient, bloody history. The island of Britain was a patchwork quilt of jealous, powerful factions, each convinced of their own supremacy and utterly unwilling to cooperate with a neighbor they had been trying to slaughter only the previous harvest season, or sometimes even the previous week. Take the mighty Catuvellauni, perhaps the most aggressive and territorially ambitious tribe in the southeast, led by fierce, uncompromising chieftains who viewed the incoming Roman invasion not as a threat to Britain, but as a potential temporary distraction for their ancient, despised rivals, the Trinovantes. The Trinovantes, whose territories encompassed the land around what would eventually become Camulodunum, were internally divided and paralyzed by fear, torn between those who wanted to instantly pay tribute to Caesar to gain an immediate edge against the Catuvellauni, and those traditionalists who screamed betrayal and demanded suicidal resistance. The Iceni, further north and famous for their fierce independence and the blinding speed of their terrifying chariot warfare, largely viewed the whole affair as merely a localized coastal skirmish, a temporary problem for the soft-handed, less hardened tribes near the shoreline who couldn't defend their own fields. The Silures in the harsh, rugged west cared even less about the eastern beaches, their focus entirely locked on maintaining their guerrilla dominance over the formidable hill forts, utterly convinced that the Romans would never bother crossing the deep, dangerous currents of the formidable Severn estuary to reach their mountain strongholds. This fragmentation was the gift Caesar prayed for. Caesar, a master strategist and a ruthless politician, wasn't aiming for total conquest yet. He was aiming for pure terror, for reconnaissance, and for a powerful demonstration of sheer, undeniable military power that would linger in the tribal memory for generations. His initial landing, near the White Cliffs of Dover, was supposed to be a straightforward affair, a surgical strike intended to intimidate the coastal tribes into immediate, permanent submission and establish a vital foothold for future, larger invasions. What he encountered on the shingle beaches was far more ferocious and chaotic than his initial intelligence reports suggested. The Britons, especially the local Canti, were masters of the terrain, emerging from the dense woodlands with terrifying speed and coordination, their bodies painted blue with woad, resembling vengeful, screaming specters erupting from the very earth itself. The sheer noise, the unholy, echoing racket of thousands of charging warriors, amplified by the resonant blasts of their long bronze war horns, was enough to momentarily halt the disciplined advance of the 7th and 10th legions, hardened veterans who thought they had truly seen every horror the world could offer. The air itself vibrated with the sound of desperate defense. But the Romans were Romans, and they adapted instantly, brutally. The sheer technological superiority and organization of Caesar's engineers and soldiers came into horrifying play. The Britons specialized in fluid hit-and-run tactics, relying heavily on their terrifyingly swift chariots, which could dart in, launch a volley of javelins, and disappear before the legionaries could form a proper defensive line. The battle for the beachhead was less a fight of equals, and more a horrific lesson in the brutal math of organized, professional warfare versus primal, chaotic, but ultimately unsustainable courage. For the Canti, watching their best warriors fall, not individually, but in systematic, crushing waves, the realization was a gut punch. The war had begun, and they were hopelessly outmatched, in method, if not in sheer, raw spirit. Caesar achieved his limited objectives. He terrified the tribes, burned a few high-value villages and coastal settlements, established that the island was immensely ripe for the taking, and then, due to logistics and the rapidly worsening autumnal weather, he made a calculated, professional withdrawal back to the mainland of Gaul. But this was no true victory for the Britons. They watched the Roman fleet vanish over the horizon, not with relief, but with a cold, paralyzing dread that settled deep into their bones. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the core of their being, that he was coming back. He had tasted the island's savagery, understood its immense, untapped resources, and most importantly, he had brutally exposed its fatal systemic weakness, the utter inability of the chieftains and the Druids to put aside their petty, ancient hatreds for the good of the entire island nation. The brief, brutal invasion of 55 BC was merely the prologue to a historical, generational trauma, a momentary, false lull before the true, annihilating storm, a storm that would arrive the following year, even bigger, even deadlier, and aimed not just at the coastlines, but straight at the very heart of the Druidic power structure and the wealth of the southeastern kingdoms. The clock was ticking down to zero, and the fragile, fragmented kingdoms of Britain were utterly unprepared for the terrifying, unforgettable lessons in total submission that Julius Caesar and the mighty Roman war machine were already preparing to teach them. The quiet, mist-shrouded shores of Britain, which had for millennia only known the chaotic clash of tribal axes and the chilling pronouncements of the Druids, were about to be ripped open by a sound that defied all primal understanding, the methodical, terrifying rhythm of 80 warships cutting through the emerald waves. This was not merely a large raiding party. This was the physical manifestation of the most ruthless, disciplined, and technologically advanced military machine the world had ever conceived, led by the man who saw himself as a god among mortals, Gaius Julius Caesar. In 55 BCE, Caesar wasn't coming to conquer Britain entirely, not yet. He was coming to send an unforgettable message, a warning scrawled in blood and fire across the chalk cliffs of the island's southeast. He had grown weary of the persistent whispers and the undeniable fact that these arrogant, heavily painted, and fiercely independent British tribes continued to offer aid, refuge, and manpower to his rebellious Gallic enemies just across the Channel. This was a punitive expedition, a catastrophic show of force, designed to paralyze the Britons with terror before the first Roman pilum was even launched. The initial logistical nightmare of assembling a massive fleet, loading thousands of perfectly trained legionaries, and navigating the treacherous, unfamiliar currents of the Channel was itself a terrifying feat of engineering that should have been the first clue to the Britons that they were dealing with something utterly alien to their experience. When the first Roman triremes finally smashed ashore near Deal in Kent, the immediate chaos was absolute. The local tribes, likely elements of the Cantiaci, had gathered their fierce, screaming warriors, ready for a standard coastal skirmish, a brutal, messy affair where courage often trumped formation. But what they faced was not a brawl. It was a geometric, relentless slaughter. The Romans, weighed down by armor, hesitated briefly in the unfamiliar surf, but Caesar's centurions drove them forward with terrifying discipline. The sight of the massive brass eagle standards, the Aquila, rising above the crashing waves was perhaps the most psychologically destructive weapon of all, symbolizing Rome's unshakable, terrifying intent. Despite the shock, the Britons responded with a fury born of desperation and the sheer will of the independent warrior. Their war chariots, the ancient, terrifying weapon system that had vanished from continental Europe centuries before, roared down the beaches, creating momentary havoc among the organized ranks. The chariot drivers were legendary, weaving their terrifying machines between the Roman shields, while the fighting men leaped out, hurled javelins, and then vaulted back onto the moving platform in a display of athletic, deadly chaos. This was pure, primal speed against organized, methodical steel. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed that the Druids' protective wards might hold, and the barbarian fury might repel the invaders. But Roman discipline was a terrifying force multiplier. The Britons could not breach the unbreakable wall of the testudo formation, that interlocking shield shell that rendered arrows and javelins utterly useless. Caesar's legions absorbed the charge, held the line, and then, with terrifying suddenness, broke formation and counterattacked, using their short, deadly gladius swords to stab, thrust, and carve through the loosely organized tribal lines. A sudden, violent storm soon crippled much of Caesar's fleet, forcing a tactical, hasty withdrawal back to Gaul. The Britons cheered, believing they had repelled the mighty conqueror, missing the crucial, terrifying detail. Caesar had learned everything he needed to know. He had mapped the coastlines, identified the key tribal weaknesses, and crucially understood the power of the British chariot warfare. 1 year later, in 54 BCE, Caesar returned, and this time there was no ambiguity. This was a full-scale invasion designed to demonstrate Rome's absolute dominance. He arrived with not 80 ships, but a staggering armada of over 800 vessels, carrying 5 full legions and 2,000 cavalry, an army of over 30,000 men that darkened the horizon and immediately erased any memory of the previous year's victory. The sheer scale of this force caused immediate panic, and, for the first time, spurred a panicked, desperate attempt at genuine tribal unification. The disparate kingdoms of the southeast, facing certain annihilation, finally agreed to elevate a single, supreme warlord to lead their defense, Catuvellauni, the formidable chief of the Catuvellauni tribe. Catuvellauni was a military genius by tribal standards, a master of swift movement and guerrilla warfare, and he knew he could not possibly face the legions in open battle. His strategy was brutal and pragmatic: avoid pitched battles, destroy the countryside, starve the Roman army, and hit them where they were weakest. He unleashed the full power of the British chariotry, harassing Caesar's slow-moving supply lines and terrifying the marching columns, using hit-and-run tactics that drove the legions to near madness. For a brief, thrilling moment, it seemed Catuvellauni might succeed in making Britain simply too expensive, too difficult, and too deadly for Rome to hold. But the terrible fractures of tribal politics, the deep-seated grudges that ran thicker than blood, quickly reasserted themselves. The Trinovantes, bitter rivals of Catuvellauni's Catuvellauni, saw an opportunity not for freedom, but for revenge, and they sent envoys directly to Caesar offering total submission, hostages, and vital intelligence in exchange for protection from their British enemies. Caesar, a brilliant tactician and even better politician, immediately accepted the surrender, effectively turning one British kingdom into a launchpad against the others. Catuvellauni, now isolated and stripped of his allies and his capital, was forced into humiliating negotiations. The terms were crushing: payment of annual tribute to Rome, the handing over of hostages, including his own sons, and a sworn oath not to attack the Trinovantes. Caesar had achieved his goal. He had not instituted full occupation, but he had shattered the tribal power structure, extracted wealth, and perhaps most terrifyingly, he had demonstrated that the ocean was no defense against the wrath of Rome. He withdrew, leaving behind not legions, but a terrifying, indelible psychological scar. The ancient kingdoms of Britain were now merely a ticking clock, waiting for the day Rome would decide to cash in its terrifying claim on the island.